Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Rumberg. I'm a managing partner with MetricNet, and I will be your host for today's webcast on desktop support best practices. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for participating in our webcast today. Before we get started, I have just a few administrative announcements to make. During the presentation, all of you will be in listen-only mode. However, if you have any questions during the webcast, you can type them in the dialog box that appears in the lower right corner of your screen, and I'll pause once during the presentation to answer questions. Additionally, I will remain on the webcast at the conclusion of the presentation to answer any final questions that you might have or that I did not get to during the first Q&A break. This webcast typically lasts about 90 minutes. So for those who have other commitments later in the day, I should be wrapped up by about 3:30 or so Eastern Time in the United States. Now, I see that quite a few of our existing clients have joined us on the webcast today, and I want to thank you for that. For those who are not familiar with MetricNet, let me give you just a brief introduction. MetricNet's core business is benchmarking. We perform benchmarks for a variety of industries and functional areas. My role in the company is to manage the desktop support, service desk, and call center benchmarks and assessments for MetricNet. The work we do for desktop support organizations worldwide spans the gambit, from benchmarking and idle maturity assessments to consolidation studies and outsourcing analyses. Typically, the IT service and support organizations that we work with are looking to optimize their performance, and we help them achieve that objective through benchmarking. For those who have not been to our website yet, I would encourage you to go and take a look around at metricnet.com. One of the unique features of the website is that we offer a free premium membership that gives you unlimited access to all of our online content. This includes our metric of the month, our webcast recordings, white papers, and presentations. All you have to do is complete a short form, and you will be enrolled as a free premium member. Each time you visit our website thereafter, you can go directly to our resource library to access all of our online content absolutely free of charge. Now, since the question of how to benchmark comes up in every webcast, I'll preempt the question right now and give you just a brief overview of MetricNet's benchmarking lineup. There are 4 ways that you can complete a benchmark with MetricNet. First, there are what we call peer group benchmarks that compare and measure your desktop support, service desk, or call center to a unique peer group. These are our custom benchmarks, and they're very comprehensive in scope. Secondly, if you're only interested in industry benchmarking data, you can download an industry benchmarking report directly from our website. Just go to metricnet.com, click the Shop button, and you'll see our industry benchmarks that are available for download. For the do-it-yourselfers, you can purchase a benchmarking data file in Excel format and conduct your own benchmarking analysis. And finally, for those interested in a continuous improvement initiative, MetricNet last year launched its one-year path to world-class performance. This program starts with a benchmark and an ROI calculation of your support organization. Following that is a 6 to 9 month improvement phase with MetricNet as your coach and guide. The program concludes with a second benchmark and ROI calculation approximately 1 year after the initial benchmark to objectively measure the progress that has been made and to prove definitively that your support organization has indeed achieved world-class performance. Now, regardless of how or when you choose to benchmark, I want to encourage all of you to connect with MetricNet on social media. We're active on all of the major social media sites. We put out a steady stream of posts, tweets, articles, discussions, and presentations that are designed to enrich the community of IT service and support professionals and to provide you with tools and insights and information that you can use to enhance your professional careers. For those who would like to follow us on Twitter during the webcast, use hashtag MetricNetLive. You can participate, share your thoughts, key points, questions, or just follow along. Now, for those who are attending the HDI conference in Las Vegas next month, I want to make you aware that MetricNet has been selected as a speaker, and I will present on 3 separate topics. The first is an overview of our benchmarking results from the 2014 desktop support benchmarks that we conducted. The second presentation will address the strategic role of leadership in IT service and support. We're talking now about CIOs, CTOs, and others in leadership roles in IT service and support, and the importance of them not only investing headcount in dollars in technology and service and support, but investing their personal time and attention and making sure that they fully engage in the service and support process. Final presentation that I'll be delivering at the HDI conference next month in Las Vegas takes a look at help desk or service desk KPIs and their evolution over the last 25 years, and what that evolution in key performance indicators tells us about the rise of the strategic service and support organization. Now, one final note before we get started, and this is particularly important for those who wish to receive a copy of today's presentation. When you exit the webcast, a brief survey will pop up on your screen. Please be aware that only those who complete the survey will receive a copy of the presentation. This survey provides us with valuable feedback on the webcast. It's only 3 questions long, and it takes about 15 seconds to complete. So if you do us a favor and answer that survey at the end of the webcast, I'd be very grateful. And in return for that courtesy, I'll send you a copy of today's presentation. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We've got 4 things on our agenda today. We'll cover the first 3 of those 4. I'll leave it to you to read the final section about MetricNet if you choose to do so when you receive a copy of today's presentation. But I'll be going through the first 3 sections, starting with a historical perspective. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's important for me to point out very early on in the presentation that everything you see and hear today is empirical in nature. It is based upon what we have observed, having completed more than 3,000 IT service and support benchmarks. Second thing, and this is where we'll spend most of our time today, is on our model for desktop support best practices. This model addresses 4 components. It talks about service and support strategy, performance measurement and management, human resource management, and finally what we call marketing, which is really about message management internal to your organization. Finally, we're going to wrap up with a call to action. I'll summarize what we've learned today and then give you 6 specific things that you can do in the next hours, days, weeks, or months that will yield positive, measurable improvements in your desktop support organization. So let's begin with our historical perspective. Once again, I want to point out that we've been doing this for quite some time, 27 years now, and during that period of time, we've completed more than 3,000 IT service and support benchmarks, and we now have the largest database in the industry of service desk and desktop support key performance indicators. We track more than 70 of them, everything from customer satisfaction and first contact resolution rate in the service desk to mean time to resolve and % resolved level 1 capable in desktop support. We have also defined and cataloged, created a taxonomy of more than 120 industry best practices. These best practices address everything from service and support strategy to technology, human resource management, performance measurement and management, i.e. metrics management, and what we call stakeholder communication. Let's take a look at how some of the key metrics have evolved since 1988, since we began collecting data on desktop support organizations worldwide. There's an interesting story to be had here, and I think as I go through these metrics, you'll start to realize how much desktop support has evolved away from its historic role as truly a support function into a much more strategic role, one that can drive a competitive advantage for the IT organization, and one that represents a source of economic contribution if you are willing to recognize and exploit the economic potential of desktop support. Now, back in 1988, the average seat that was supported by a desktop support organization generated about half a ticket, meaning that every other month 1 ticket would be generated by each seat that was supported. Last year, that number had increased to about 0.8, which is an indication that the complexity of the environment has increased over those 25 years, which is no surprise or should be no surprise to anybody. The cost per ticket has more than doubled. It was $29, and this is adjusted for inflation. Back in 1988, it was $29 a ticket, fully loaded cost. Last year, that number was up to $62, and the primary reason for that is that the work time per incident had increased from about 17.5 minutes all the way to 32.25 minutes. So the work time per incident had almost doubled during that 25-year period of time. Hence, the cost went up fairly dramatically from $29 per ticket to $62 per ticket. Now is where the data starts to get very interesting. If we look at the number of incidents that were resolved on the initial contact with the device or the user, back in 1988 it was 74%. Last year that number was 68%. You might look at that and think, well, gosh, we're going backwards on that metric. If we were resolving more incidents on first contact with the user or the device back in 1988 than we were last year, then we must be losing ground. But there's a lot more to the story than that. And specifically, if we look at a metric called % resolved level 1 capable, I know that's a mouthful, but essentially what it means is this. You look at the tickets resolved by desktop support, and you look at the tickets that could have and should have been resolved at level 1 by the service desk. Let's say that desktop support handles 1,000 tickets a month, and they have some way of measuring the number of tickets that could have and should have been resolved at level 1, and they ascertain that that number was 200 tickets. In that case, your percent resolved level 1 capable would be 200 tickets divided by 1,000 tickets, or 20%. Back in 1988, that number was 54%, which says that more than half of all tickets being resolved by the desktop could have been resolved by level 1 support. And that's a reflection, to a certain extent, of how much level 1 support has evolved over the last 25 years. 25 years ago, level 1 support used to be largely a message-taking function. It was a bag and tag function where they would do password resets and printer recycles, but anything more complicated than that got pushed out to some other level within IT or got pushed out to desktop support. So more than half the tickets being resolved by desktop support in 1988 could have and should have been resolved at level 1. By last year, that number was down to 22%. It's still a fairly large number. It says that 22% in 2014, 22% of all tickets being resolved at desktop support could have and should have been resolved by level 1 support. And this is important. You'll see in a few minutes here when we start talking about the total cost of ownership in service and support that every ticket resolved by desktop support that could have and should have been resolved at level 1 ends up costing you a lot more money. So these are fairly costly defects, and you want to get this number, percent resolved level 1 capable, as low as it can possibly be. But the backstory on this incidents resolved on first contact is essentially that the contacts became a lot more complex, a lot more difficult during these 25 years, as evidenced by the fact that back in 1988, more than half of the tickets could have been resolved remotely. Those are relatively simple tickets for desktop support to resolve. Last year, the number was down to 22%. So what you're left with is a more complex ticket set, and naturally, you might expect that the FCR for incidents might decline a little bit, which is exactly what has happened. We also see that adjusted for current dollars, adjusted for inflation over the last 25 years, that desktop support technicians on average in North America were being hired at about $37,000 back in 1988. Last year, the average starting salary for a desktop support tech was almost $44,000. It was $43,627. Now, this number varied pretty dramatically. In some places out in Sunnyvale, California, for example, there were desktop support techs that were getting starting offers in the high 60s, $67,000, $68,000. There were also desktop support technicians in Winchester, Kentucky, and Biloxi, Mississippi, that were starting in the high 20s and low 30s. And that's a reflection of prevailing wage rates in different geographies. This number is affected pretty dramatically by geography. But when we look across the United States, across North America, including Canada, I should say, back in 1988, the average starting salary was about $37,000. Last year, it was over $43,000. You can look at that and draw a couple of different conclusions, possibly. One conclusion might be that IT is becoming more benevolent, and they've just decided to pay their technicians more. That turns out not to be the case. What is the case is the recognition that when desktop support is willing to pay a little bit more in starting salary, they are able to attract a more qualified candidate, a better educated candidate, a more experienced candidate, and hence they get better metrics from those candidates. They get better first contact resolution rates, and they get a lower metric for percent resolved level 1 capable. And overall, what they've managed to do by increasing the starting salaries for desktop support technicians is that they have actually reduced this cost per ticket over time. It's a counterintuitive notion, but it turns out that when you are willing to pay a little bit more, this is true at level 1 as well as at desktop support. It's called the wage rate paradox, that up to a certain point, if you are willing to increase the starting wages of the level 1 techs or the desktop support techs, your actual cost, your total cost of ownership will decrease up to a point. You can't hire a bunch of PhDs making $150,000 a year and expect your cost to go down. But up to a certain point, if you're willing to increase starting salaries, what will happen is that your total cost of ownership will drop because you'll get better resolution times, quicker mean times to resolve, lower work times, lower handle times, and overall better economics. And so the industry has sort of discovered this by trial and error over the last 25 years, and one implication has been the increase in starting salaries. Finally, if we look at what it costs to support one seat for an entire year, back in 1988, if you look at the number of tickets generated per seat, cost per ticket, it cost about $200 or $184 to support one seat for 1 year. Last year, that number was almost $600. So the cost of supporting one seat for 1 year has increased threefold during this 25-year period of time. That, once again, is a reflection of the fact that the environment is more complex. It's generating more tickets per seat. The handle time is almost twice what it was, or the work time is almost twice what it was back in 1988, and the costs have increased per ticket fairly dramatically. So what we've got now is an average cost of supporting an end user of about $600 per year. So this is a real quick look at how these KPIs have evolved over the last 25 years, and this gives us insight into and clues about how desktop support has been evolving and how it continues to evolve as a strategic source of competitive advantage for those organizations that are willing to recognize it and exploit it. Now, as we get further into our discussion, you're going to hear me talk about tickets, incidents, and service requests, so it makes sense right up front to define those. An incident generally is unplanned work. It might be a hardware break fix or a device failure, for example. Service requests, by contrast, typically are planned. These would include things like moves, adds, and changes, hardware or software upgrades, device refreshes, and so on. But if you add the two up, if you add up your incidents and your service requests, you end up with your total ticket volume. So a ticket could be an incident or a ticket could be a service request, but if you add the two together, incidents plus service requests equals your ticket volume. Now, I'm well aware of the fact that not everybody follows this same vernacular, but for the purposes of this discussion, and this really actually does represent a consensus of opinion in the industry, generally this is how incident service requests and tickets are viewed in the industry, but we do recognize that some of you may have a slightly different terminology or vernacular when it comes to tickets, incidents, and service requests. Second thing I want to do as we get launched here is talk about what it means to be world-class, because you are going to hear me refer on and off throughout the presentation to being world-class, adopting best practices, achieving world-class performance, and the like. There's 4 components of our definition. The first one is that you are a high-quality desktop support organization, which means that you're consistently exceeding customer expectations. If you're in the top quartile on customer satisfaction for desktop support, you're going to have a customer satisfaction that is percent satisfied or very satisfied with desktop support of 93% or more. Second part of this, though, is that your mean times to resolve are below average for both incidents and service requests. What that means is that it takes you less than 0.7 of 1 business day to resolve an incident and less than 3.8 business days to resolve service requests. These are metrics from the industry. So if you're delivering this level of quality, you've achieved 1 criteria for world-class performance. But there are 3 additional criteria. The second one has to do with costs. And what we look for is your cost per ticket, your cost per incident, your cost per service request below average. We also want to see some evidence that you understand total cost of ownership and you've taken steps to reduce that total cost of ownership. One indication is when this number drops to below 15 or even 10%. That's a pretty good indication that you understand the cost of these defects, the cost of these tickets resolved at desktop support, and you've taken steps to minimize the percent resolve level 1 capable. This is a TCO concept, and if you recognize that, you can help reduce total cost of ownership. Thirdly, and a little bit more subjectively, you're following industry best practices. And today's webcast is, as much as anything else, about immersing you in those industry best practices, about helping you understand what it means to be a world-class desktop support organization and what the practices are that characterize those world-class organizations. The good news is the best practices are pretty well defined and documented at this point, and we want to see, when we're trying to determine whether or not an organization has in fact achieved world-class performance, we want to see evidence that they are following these industry best practices, that they're not making it up as they go along, that they're not trying to reinvent the wheel, that they really have adopted and adapted those industry best practices into their desktop support organization. Fourth, and perhaps most subjective, is that every transaction adds value. And when I talk about adding value, what I mean is that the customer comes away from their interactions with desktop support feeling like they had a good experience. You want to deliver a positive customer experience. This, as it turns out, does a lot more than drive a positive view of desktop support. It turns out to drive a positive view for all of information technology, because desktop support and the service desk represent the gateway to IT for the vast majority of end users. And when those end users have a good experience at desktop support or the service desk, they tend to project that impression onto all of IT. So good experience means they think good about all of IT. A bad or a poor experience with support, they're likely to project that negative experience onto all of IT. And I'm going to show you some data on that as we get deeper into our presentation. Another way of looking at what it means to be a world-class organization can be illustrated in this two-dimensional chart where we're looking at cost per ticket on the x-axis, higher cost on the right, lower cost on the left. Quality is measured by customer satisfaction on the y-axis. Higher quality as you move up the axis, lower quality as you move down the axis. If we take a representative cross-section of data points from our database and put them on this chart, we find that they tend to fall in between these two lines. The upper line we call the best-in-class performance curve. The lower line, I've named it the average performance curve. It's really the below average performance curve, but just for the sake of being nice to those that are closer to this curve, I've called it the average performance curve. Now, you'll see that the data falls between these two lines. Not only that, the data tends to be nonlinear, which says that there are diminishing returns here. As you increase your quality, your cost increases disproportionately. That should not be a surprise. This happens for almost any product or service. Whether you're buying a car, a house, a ticket, or a seat on an airplane, or anything else, there are diminishing returns associated with that as well. As the quality improves, the cost tends to increase disproportionately. So that's one of the first observations we can make about this. Now, implicit in that observation is also the observation that these two metrics are correlated. And it's not just a correlation, it's a cause and effect relationship. The cause is cost, the effect is quality almost always, because most organizations aren't told, well, you need to achieve this level of quality and we'll give you whatever budget you need to achieve that level of quality. Normally, the conversation goes something like this. Last year you spent $2.2 million. This year we're going to let you spend $2.3 million, so drive the best quality you can with that $2.3 million. I'm paraphrasing, of course, and I'm oversimplifying, but that's the nature of the discussion as it happens in most organizations. So you don't have a whole lot of control over the quality, except that you can take the limited resources you have, the headcount, the dollars, the technology, the office space, and the like, and deploy it in the most effective way possible. And if you do that, you have optimized your performance. You will end up on this upper curve, what we call the best-in-class performance curve. If you are less successful at using your resources efficiently, you're going to end up somewhere below that curve. But being world-class is not about achieving some absolute level of performance. You know, I get questions almost every day about what cost per ticket, what customer satisfaction, what mean time to resolve, what % resolved level 1 capable. What are the metrics for me to be designated a world-class desktop support organization? Well, the answer is it depends. If you're budget constrained and you can only spend $40 a ticket, what we look for is, are you spending that $40 per ticket in a way that gives you the best possible outcome? By contrast, if you have enough budgetary power or enough resources to spend $200 a ticket, we expect much, much better performance, higher customer satisfaction, quicker mean times to resolve, lower % resolved level 1 capable metrics. We look for a lot more in those organizations that are spending $200, $250, $300 per ticket than we would expect from an organization that's spending $30 or $40 or $50 per ticket. So being world-class, it does not have an absolute definition. It has a relative definition. And the relative definition is if you're using your limited resources and deploying them in such a way that you achieve the best possible outcome, i.e. you end up on this upper curve, you are in fact a world-class support organization. So with that definition, that brings us to the first polling question of the day, and that polling question, as you can imagine, has to do with world-class performance. And the question is this: do you consider your desktop support function to be world-class? Remember, there's 4 components of that definition. Number 1, you're high quality, you exceed customer expectations. Number 2, you are low cost. Number 3, you're following industry best practices. And number 4, you're adding value on every single transaction. By the way, I want to thank all of you for dialing in today. We've got individuals on this webcast from more than 20 countries, and some of you are literally 12 time zones away from where I am. I'm in Washington, D.C., or just outside of Washington, D.C., and we've got people that are dialed in from Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and a host of other countries in that part of the world. I know it's the middle of the night, and I genuinely appreciate you dialing in. But even for those that are in my time zone or in other time zones in the United States, I appreciate the fact that you took time out of your busy schedules to participate today in MetricNet's webcast. Okay, I'd like to see a few more people weigh in on this if you consider your desktop support function to be world-class, and then we'll close down the poll and I'll show you what those results look like. Here we go. This is the best result we've ever had. I've been doing this webinar now for about 8 years, and I've never seen a result that's good. But more than 40% of you, first time we've broken the 40% barrier, do believe, based on the definition that I've just provided you, that you are a world-class desktop support function. Well, kudos to you. I congratulate you, because that's, as I mentioned, that's the best result we've ever seen. Another 49% of you said no. Let me offer some words of encouragement. As it turns out, it's not that hard. It doesn't take that long, and it shouldn't cost that much money to achieve world-class performance. And in fact, what we're starting today, what we're going through today in the webcast should give you a real good head start, a real good push in the right direction in terms of achieving world-class performance in your desktop support organization. Those who answered not applicable are consultants or others who are unaffiliated with desktop support organizations. So this is a good result. And again, I congratulate those who believe that they have achieved world-class performance, and I offer words of encouragement for those that want to get there. As it turns out, the path is pretty well lit, and today's webcast should give you a head start on achieving that level of performance. So let me close that polling question down, and we're going to move on now in our best practices discussion. And specifically, what we're going to talk about now is our 4-part model for world-class performance. It addresses IT service and support strategy. It addresses performance measurement and management. It addresses human resource management and what we call marketing, which is really about managing your message. Let's get right into strategy. And I want to present some provocative data here. If you were on our webcast last month, you saw this, so some of this may be review for some of you. But there's something called the paradox in IT service and support. And specifically, the paradox is this. Only about 4% of IT spending is devoted to the service desk and desktop support. The other 96% is for things like application development, application maintenance, network operations. You've got mainframe and mid-range computing. You've got contracted services like disaster recovery. But only about 4% of all IT budgets are spent on service and support. And I define that as being the level 1 service desk and the desktop support organization. Now, because it's less than 5%, because it's a relatively small piece of the total budget, many, including CIOs and especially, I should say, those in leadership positions within IT organizations, they tend to assume that there's not much upside opportunity. It's a 4% line item in their budget, and they tend to view it as a cost center, meaning that it's a cost, it's a keep the lights on function, it's almost a necessary evil. What we want to figure out how to do is to minimize the cost in this cost center. But what our empirical data shows us is that the most effective support organizations, and I'll define what that is momentarily, they focus on maximizing value. So it's not about minimizing the cost, it's about how do you invest the right amount so that you can achieve the best economic outcome for the organization. And I'm going to show you how that economic outcome is measured. But those are the most successful organizations, not the ones that are good at minimizing their costs, not the ones that are managed as cost centers, but the ones that are managed as value centers, the recognition being that there's an opportunity, there's leverage here to exploit economic value, to create economic value for the enterprise. And if you invest in the right way, we're not talking about spending money mindlessly, we're talking about investing in the right things at the right time, at the right place in desktop support, and exploiting the economic potential of desktop support. One of those economic potentials has to do with total cost of ownership. Another one has to do with improving end user productivity. A key part of what desktop support and the service desk do is make end users more productive. And that's a significant benefit to the organization. That is the primary source of economic value contributed both by the level 1 service desk and by desktop support. And the third thing, I alluded to this a couple of times already, is that the service desk and desktop support have the power as the gateway to IT for the vast majority of end users. You have the power to drive a positive view of corporate IT. Let me show you some data on this. Last year in North America, the average cost of resolving a ticket at level 1 was about $22. This is a fully loaded cost. It includes not just salaries and benefits for the agents, it also includes salaries and benefits for the indirect personnel like the supervisors and the team leads and the workforce schedulers, the QA/QC people, the trainers, and the like. But it also includes facilities expense, it includes technology expense, telecom expense, travel, training, office supplies. It's a fully loaded cost divided by all incoming contacts. Now that same number for desktop support, what was the cost per ticket fully loaded in North America last year was about $62 for a ticket that got pushed out to what we call N-level IT. This might be an application group, a networking group, a NOC, for example. $85 a ticket. Field support, you got to jump in a vehicle, go to the site of the issue, about $196, and then vendor support, almost $500. Now, this is why they say get it done at level 1. It's not just a catchphrase. There's real economic value in getting it done at level 1, and if you take a level 1 ticket that could and should have been resolved at level 1 and you instead resolve it at level 2, you are incurring not $40 extra, you are incurring an incremental $62. So if a ticket comes in at the front end of a SPOC, single point of contact support organization, you're going to incur on average $22 for that ticket. And if it gets pushed out to desktop support, add another $62 to that. Or if it gets pushed to level 3, add another $85 to that. So these are additive costs here. And this really helps explain what's called shift left. If I take this diagram and rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, we get a diagram that looks like this. Here's level 1 support, $22 for the service desk. Level 2 or desktop support at $62. Level 3, $85, same number that came off here. Field support, $196. Vendor support, $471. I've added 2 additional levels here. Level 0 is self-help. On average, there's no direct cost to the service desk for this, but what you have is an investment, a capital cost for creating the self-help portal, the knowledge, the search engine, the natural language search query engine, etc. You take the capital cost of creating that as well as the maintenance of that, you amortize it, and you end up with, on average, about $2 per self-help resolution. And then there's level -1, which is incident prevention. In other words, the user just doesn't have the problem, either because they've been trained appropriately or because through root cause analysis, the service desk or desktop support organization have eliminated that source of incidents. There are various ways that you can drive this level -1 resolution rate, and that's the best incident of all, is the incident that never happens, either because the user doesn't have the problem or because they've been trained or because they have tools to solve their own problem. But this shift left concept is starkly illustrated on this chart. The idea is if you can shift left, move a level 2 ticket to level 1, you can reduce the cost of resolution. In some cases, if you can take a level 1 ticket, move it to level 0, and I say in some cases because it's not always a smart thing to have a user engage in self-help. Self-help makes sense for easy things like password resets and Microsoft Office support. But when you get situations, which I've seen recently, where you have, for example, R&D scientists in a big pharma that spend an hour trying to resolve their own problem in a self-help portal, that's not a good use of their time. It would make a whole lot more sense for them to simply call the service desk, get the resolution in 15 or 20 minutes, and move on with their day-to-day job responsibilities. And we have seen situations, unfortunately, where this self-help concept is abused or not applied in the proper way. Not all incidents that can be resolved through self-help should be resolved through self-help. The rule of thumb I've got is that if the user can self-resolve in 10 minutes or less, great, let them do it. But 10 minutes or more, again, it's a rough rule of thumb, they ought to be just calling the service desk and getting it resolved that way, because chances are they're going to get a quicker resolution that way, and it's going to reduce the cost for everybody, as opposed to them spending, say, 20 minutes, a half hour, an hour or more in a self-help portal trying to resolve their own issues. Now, in order to make this work, that is to minimize total cost of ownership, to maximize level 1 resolution rate, you really need a SPOC support organization. SPOC stands for single point of contact. So the diagram here shows the user community. You've got the level 1 service desk, and then you've got N-level support, desktop, field support, level 2, vendor support. Now, some of the key SPOC principles are these. You need to take an end-to-end view of user support. That is, you can't be siloing these things. Service desk can't be operating independently of desktop support and vice versa. Second thing is that you do need a single point of contact, and that single point of contact is the level 1 service desk. This is not a turf issue. It's not an organizational issue. It's nothing like that at all. It simply makes sense for the service desk to be that single point of entry into the IT service and support system. Now, that doesn't mean that level 1 support solves everything. In fact, far from it. Their goal, or their role, I should say, is triaging tickets, that is getting them out quickly to where they need to be resolved if they can't be resolved at level 1, resolution at level 1 when possible, effective handoffs to what we call N-level support, these other support levels, resolution, coordination, and facilitation. Some companies even have people called ticket chasers, meaning that they're watching the service levels, and when that service level starts ticking down, they'll get on the phone with desktop support or field support or vendor support or the application group or the NOC or whomever the ticket happens to be with at the time, and say, hey, we got a half hour left on this service level. What's happening? Get with it. Get this thing resolved. And I also say ticket closure. This doesn't mean that the service desk has to physically close a ticket. In fact, that's probably not a best practice, but rather that they need to ensure that the tickets are closed, if not by the level 1 service desk, then by the last individual that touched that ticket, presumably the last individual or the last entity, the one that resolved that ticket. Now, in this SPOC system, single point of contact system, drive-bys, flybys, and snags are strongly discouraged. You may have heard of this terminology before. A drive-by is when a user is sitting at their desk, they see a desktop support technician, and they grab the person and say, hey, can you help me archive these old Outlook items, or can you help me turn these rows into columns in Excel? The answer from the support person should be, well, you really need to call the service desk, and if it's appropriate, they will dispatch a desktop support technician to help you. It's also called a flyby or a snag. Now, it's real nice for those end users that they can just grab a desktop support technician and get them to resolve their issue on the fly, on the spot. However, it does increase your total cost of ownership when it comes to service and support. If your end users have grown used to having desktop support technicians around and they've fallen into the habit of using them for these drive-bys, flybys, and snags, it is, I will admit, hard to wean them off of that. And if you do, if you start enforcing a SPOC process and force them or essentially tell them, no, you really need to call the level 1 service desk, and if they believe that if they can't resolve it, they will dispatch me if necessary. Your customer service, or excuse me, your customer satisfaction will take a temporary hit. I'll be the first one to admit that. But in the long run, it will recover, and better yet, it will not only recover, but you will have a viable SPOC model, and you will have reduced your costs because you'll be doing more of these $22 tickets and less of these $62 tickets. Now, here's the data on SPOC and the fact that it does reduce total cost of ownership. What we've got here is more than 100 data points. We've got blue diamonds, which are from support organizations that operate in a single point of contact environment with a SPOC model. And then we've got these fuchsia squares, percent resolved level 1 capable. They do not have single point of contact. Now, percent resolved level 1 capable. Remember, this is the percentage of tickets resolved by desktop support that could have and should have been resolved at level 1. You can see that if you don't run under a SPOC model, that number is about 23%, which says that 23% of the tickets you resolved could and should have been resolved at level 1 when you're not operating with a SPOC model. If you are operating with a SPOC model, remember, a lower number is better when it comes to percent resolved level 1 capable. It represents fewer defects, fewer of these tickets resolved for $62, more tickets resolved at $22. That's the value of the SPOC model. For those organizations, a little more than 50 of them shown on this chart, the average percent resolved level 1 capable operating with a SPOC model was 15.3%. You can see there's about an 8 or 7.5 percentage point difference between these two. There's the proof positive that a single point of contact support model does in fact drive lower total cost of ownership. Now, a second source of economic value created by service and support is displayed on this chart. And this, by the way, is the most complex chart I'm going to show today. It's not that complicated once you've had a few minutes to look at it. Hopefully I've explained it halfway decently. So let me start with that. Let me start with an explanation of what I've got on this chart. We had 60 companies participate in a benchmark with MetricNet. They participated in both a service desk and a desktop support benchmark. Based on their performance, we organized them into quartiles. Though the 15, one quartile, 15 out of 60, 1/4, one quartile, the best performers, best 15 performers were lined up right here. The next quartile, second group, second best 15 performers lined up right here. Third group, third quartile, fourth quartile, the worst performers. That is the ones that had the weakest performance on their service desk and desktop support. They're lined up here. I'll explain this y-axis momentarily. These are the 4 quartiles of data, 15 data points stacked on top of each other in each one of these quartiles. What we did is we hypothesized, we surmised that desktop support organizations that were doing a better job would actually make their end users more productive. And the way we went about proving that was to select at random within those organizations users that over a 1-month period of time would track the amount of lost productivity as a result of IT-related issues. Now, your average user now has more than 3 devices. When you add up their smartphones, their tablets, their laptop computers or desktop computers. Some of our clients even have servers and printers in their offices, but the average user now has more than 3 devices. And when those devices don't work the way they're supposed to for whatever reason, hardware problem, software problem, network problem, whatever it might be, productivity is impeded. They're usually not completely out of business, although that can happen. If you've got a field salesperson and their hard drive fails, they probably can't even work until they get a new hard drive, until they get a new computer. But in most cases, that is not what happens. You're not completely out of business. Your productivity is just impeded. And so what we ask these random users within these companies to do is keep track over a 1-month period of time, use the stopwatch on your smartphone, and over a 1-month period of time, what we want you to do is keep track of the amount of lost productivity. Now, we realize there's some estimates that go into this. When you lose productive hours, it isn't always cut and dried. It's not like, well, my computer stopped working at noon and it started at 4 p.m. and so I lost 4 productive hours. It's usually not like that. It's more like, well, my tablet, this application wasn't opening properly and I had to call support. It took them an hour to get back to me. They did this. In the meantime, I was working from my phone or I was working from my laptop computer, and overall, the whole incident lasted about 6 hours, and I would guess that I probably lost about 2 hours of productive time during that period of time. That's more likely the scenario when they're recording their lost time over this 1-month period of time. The point is that they each made their best effort, within each of these 60 companies, multiple people within each company made their best effort to determine how much lost productivity they had over a period of a month. We just extrapolated that out. And what we found is that for those organizations that had top quartile service and support, that is the best performers in service desk and desktop support, their average end user is still losing about 17 productive hours a year due to these various IT-related problems and issues and outages. By contrast, for those that performed in the bottom quartile, and this sort of proved our hypothesis, we surmised that this would be the case. It turned out to be the case, even more so than we were expecting. If you're unlucky enough to work in one of these organizations, you're going to lose about 47 productive hours a year. That's more than a full week. That's a week and a day. Think about that. If you're in a top quartile organization, you still lose about 2 productive days per year. If you're in an organization that is in the 4th quartile, you're losing about 6 productive days per year. There's a huge difference between the top quartile performers and the bottom quartile performers in terms of the productive hours that they return to their end users. And so this y-axis, which I told you a few moments ago I would define for you, is in fact the productive hours lost per end user per year. Now multiply these 17 hours or these 47 hours by the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals that work in some of these large corporations, and you begin to realize that desktop support and the service desk have a real opportunity here, if they perform well, to make end users more productive. And that number can be monetized. 17.1 productive hours per year, that's 2 person days per year. Multiply that by 1,000 employees, and you got 2,000 person days per year. You can monetize that and figure out what that's worth to the organization. This number is a lot more, 47 hours. You're losing a lot of productive time, hence you're losing a lot of economic productivity. So the upshot of this is the following. If you're one of the top performers, especially if you're in the top quartile of IT service and support providers, you're creating real economic value for your organization by making the end users more productive. Third thing I want to point out is that service and support as the gateway to IT for the vast majority of end users has a disproportionate influence on what end users think of all of IT. Now, this is from a survey we did a few years back. There were more than 1,000 corporations that participated in this. We knew that they were surveying their customers every year. That is, IT did a company-wide survey every year, and we asked them, can we insert a question into your survey? We will take the results, and we will give you the results of that from all 1,044 organizations that participate. And what the question that we inserted into that survey was essentially, what is it that drives, what is the biggest driver, the 3 biggest drivers of your opinion of corporate IT? It was a multiple choice question. They could pick their top 3, which is why these numbers add up to more than 100%. And it was a big multiple choice question. There were more than 20 answers that we offered them. The number 1 answer in terms of what drives your view of corporate IT, the service desk. The second most popular answer, what drives your view of corporate IT, desktop support. Now this makes sense if you think about it, because the vast majority of end users don't spend a lot of time in the NOC or the data center. They don't spend a lot of time with the application developers, but they do spend a lot of time, or they frequently contact service and support. On average, they're going to contact the service desk twice a month. On average, they're going to have contact with desktop support every other month, 1/2 of 1 ticket or a little bit more than every other month because you saw the data very early on in this presentation, roughly 0.8 tickets per end user per month. So those frequent interactions are how end users form their opinion about all of IT. And this is where the leverage comes in. When I talked about the paradox of service and support, even though this service and support represents only 4% of the total spending of IT, it has a disproportionate influence on what end users think about all of IT. Now, this should be a wake-up call or at least enlightenment for CIOs that hadn't seen this before or didn't understand where the leverage was in their organization, because if I'm a CIO or a CTO or a director or a manager within an IT organization and I see this, my marching orders are pretty clear. I'm going to invest whatever technology, headcount, and dollars necessary, but not only that, I'm going to invest my personal time and attention with the support organization, both service desk and desktop support, to ensure that they have whatever they need to deliver high-quality service to my end users, because they are the key to my success. If the end users have a good experience with service and support, they're going to think good things about all of IT. That's a proxy for my effectiveness. That's going to make me look good. So there's huge leverage here. And quite frankly, and I say this in every one of my presentations to CIOs, this represents job security. If you want to know where to get job security as a CIO, a CTO, or a manager or leader in IT, in the IT organization, look no further than service and support. This is by far your greatest source of leverage. You have a huge opportunity here to drive a positive view of all of IT. Let's switch gears now and talk about key performance indicators. Page 28, there are about 30 KPIs here. It's a big, ugly list. I'm going to tell you in a minute that there's an 80-20 rule when it comes to these KPIs, and there's actually a short list of the metrics that really matter. There are 7 categories of metrics listed here. We've got cost, quality, productivity, service level metrics, technician, workload, and ticket handling metrics. But this doesn't even scratch the surface. There literally are hundreds of metrics, but these are the ones that are the most common. These are the ones that we see kind of day in and day out. I want to give you one slightly different way of looking at these KPIs. We've organized them into 3 categories here. We've organized them into what are called macro measures. These are measures that tell a story about your performance, but they're not directly actionable. You can't tweak them directly. There are drivers. These are the underlying drivers of the macro measures. These are the ones that you have control over. They include your productivity, your service level, technician, your productivity, your service level, your technician metrics, and your ticket handling metrics. You do have control over those. They do drive your macro measures. And then you have these causal factors or workload metrics, which are a function of the causal factors. Your workload metrics you can't do anything about. They're a function of the environment that you are in. And I want to elaborate on this just a little bit, because I am asked at least once a week by clients and prospective clients, how many technicians do I need? And usually the question is more like a statement. It's, I've got 2,500 end users. How many technicians do I need? Well, the number of technicians really doesn't depend on the number of users. What it depends upon is the workload. And although that workload is a weak function of the number of users that you are supporting or the number of seats that you're supporting, it is much more a function of things like the device count and mix. For example, desktop versus laptop. Laptops require more care and feeding than desktop computers do. They fail more often, they get banged around more often, they get lost more often, hard drive crashes more often. And so if you've got a larger mix of laptops versus desktops, you're going to be spending more time on those. The number of mobile devices will impact the workload. The average age, how often do you refresh, that impacts. The extent to which you've standardized and virtualized your environment will impact the workload. Your population density. If it takes you 5 minutes to walk to and from the site of a ticket, that's high density. You're in a high-rise building. You're co-located with the end users you're supporting. The travel time per ticket will be relatively low. That's a high user population density. By contrast, if you're working on a big military base, say Camp Pendleton in Southern California, it's not unusual for desktop techs there to handle just 1 ticket a day, maybe 2 tickets a day, because they travel so far between their tickets. That's a low user population density. The work location, are your users in an office, working from home, are they out in the field? There are a lot of factors that will impact the workload and hence the number of technicians you need. So the right question is not, how many technicians do I need given that I've got 2,500 end users? The right question is, here's how much workload is being generated. Here's how many tickets, here's how many service requests are being generated. The average travel time per ticket is 20 minutes, on and on and on. You need to look at workload, not end users. Now, to further that concept just a little bit, I want to point you to our website in case you're interested. There are some white papers. These are just 3 white papers that have, that specifically address this issue of desktop support metrics and headcount. We've got a white paper on how to determine the appropriate headcount of technicians in your desktop support organization. We've got a white paper called the 8 Essential KPIs for Managing Desktop Support. And we've got a white paper called the True Cost of Desktop Support. So I just want to make you aware of that. These are always free on our website. If you become a free premium member, you just fill out a form and you can download all the content that you want to. But I wanted to make you aware, for those that are interested, that we do have additional resources and information on our website about things like determining the appropriate headcount for your desktop support organization. Now, we've all heard this expression, if you're not managing it, you're not measuring it. Sorry, I lost my control panel for a moment there. Let me see if I can get it back. Okay. So the expression is, if you're not measuring it, you're not managing it. But there is, if I can get my page to turn here, technical difficulties. Okay. There's a whole lot more to the issue than that. Historically, what we have found in desktop support is that organizations spend way too much time measuring and not enough time acting on those measures. But as you can see from this arrow right here, the value of this increases as you move up the pyramid. And so what we want to suggest, and this has emerged in the last 3 to 5 years in desktop support, what we want to suggest is a different approach to performance measurement and management, an approach that emphasizes action and analysis much more than it emphasizes the measurement. Measurements by themselves are interesting, but you can't do much with them. They only become valuable if you spend time interpreting them and spend time developing action plans based upon them and then actually do something about them. So this holistic approach to performance measurement and management de-emphasizes measurement, and it emphasizes analysis, prescription, and action. And that's why I pointed out earlier that there's an 80-20 rule when it comes to this big, ugly mess of metrics on page 28. I'm going to show you what that 80-20 rule is momentarily. In fact, right now, these are the metrics that really matter. And one of the white papers I just showed you, the 8 Essential KPIs for Desktop Support, are actually listed here. Your cost per ticket, your customer satisfaction. Cost is your measure of efficiency. Customer satisfaction is your measure of effectiveness. These are the yin and yang of service and support. They are always in tension, and that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But you can never get rid of that tension. What you can try and do is minimize it. You can try and find the point of minimum tension where cost and customer satisfaction are in balance with each other. These are known as the foundation metrics because everything you do in service and support boils down to one of two things. You are either trying to contain your costs or you are trying to drive a higher quality customer experience. Now, they are driven respectively by utilization. Technician utilization, this is a labor-intensive function. The more effectively you utilize your technicians, the lower your costs are going to be. The higher your FCR for incidents will be, and the lower your mean times to resolve, the higher your customer satisfaction will be. So remember when I talked about these metrics here, the drivers, that's what I'm referring to now. The underlying drivers of cost and customer satisfaction are utilization, underlying driver of cost, FCR, mean time to resolve, underlying driver of customer satisfaction. Then we've got our TCL metric. I've defined it earlier, percentage of tickets resolved by desktop support that could and should have been resolved by level 1 support. Technician job satisfaction is a bellwether metric. It has a ripple effect throughout the organization. What we found is that if technician job satisfaction is high, morale will be good, and almost every other metric in service and support will take care of itself. So this is an important metric. A lot of people scratch their heads when they see that, and they think, how could that be so important? Well, it's important because it does have this secondary effect on just about every other KPI in desktop support. And then we've got something called the balanced scorecard. And the reason the scorecard is important is because even if we boil it down to these 7 metrics here, it's still sometimes difficult to answer the question, are we better off this month than we were last month? Are we better off this quarter than we were last quarter? Are we better off this year than we were last year? Because these metrics are oftentimes moving in different directions. If my cost per ticket goes down, and my customer satisfaction also goes down, am I better off or worse off? If my cost goes down and my customer satisfaction goes up, I'm probably better off. That's obvious. But it's not always so obvious because you've got all these moving parts. You've got these metrics that sometimes move in different directions. And the balanced scorecard is a very elegant solution to answer that question. Are we better off and how are we trending over time? The way we construct the scorecard, this particular example, I've got 8 metrics included in the scorecard over here. You can see them listed here. We then put a weight on each of those metrics. You can see that we've overweighted cost and customer satisfaction because those are the foundation metrics, the two most important metrics, or the two most important categories of metrics. We've got cost per incident, cost per service request here. You can see that things like technician job satisfaction, mean time to complete a service request, they only get 5% weighting. They're still important metrics, though. That's why they're on the scorecard. Then for a representative peer group, and this is important, you need to make sure that the metrics that go in the third and fourth columns from the left are comparable to your own desktop support organization. Who are the worst performers in your representative peer group, and what are the best performers in your representative peer group? In other words, what's the lowest cost per incident, lowest cost per service request, highest customer satisfaction, highest utilization, and so on. What you would then do is put your own performance in the third column from the right. So this would represent your monthly or quarterly performance. And you can calculate a metric score that will range between 0 and 100% based upon this interpolation formula. We look at the worst case in your peer group and we subtract your actual performance. That becomes the numerator of this ratio. The denominator of the ratio is the range, which is the worst case minus the best case. Now, a high number, as we have here on cost per incident, 90%, means that you are much closer to the best end of the spectrum than you are to the worst end of the spectrum. A lower number, as we've got here on technician utilization, means that you are much closer to the worst end of the spectrum than you are to the best end of the spectrum. Again, this is just a linear interpolation. It tells you how far along the path you are from the worst case to the best case. Now, when we multiply the metric score by the metric weighting, we end up with a balanced score for each of the 8 metrics in the scorecard. When we add that together, we come up with one number, well, 67.1% in this particular example. Turns out when we take hundreds of desktop support organizations and run them through this algorithm, we get a nice normal distribution, a nice bell-shaped curve centered right above 50%, with tails running off to the right above 70%, tails running off to the left below 30%. Typically, if you're above 60%, you're in the top quartile. If you're 50 to 60%, you're second quartile. 40 to 50, you'd be third quartile. And if you're below 40%, you're going to be in the fourth quartile. Now, this also enables you to compare yourself to others. This particular chart shows roughly 100 desktop support organizations. Here's the score we just calculated, 67.1%. Here's the orange bar for 67.1%. The average for this peer group, 51.9%. That's the orange dashed line that is going through this chart. The beauty of this scorecard is that you can now compare yourself to other desktop support organizations on a fair level playing field on an apples-to-apples basis. And you can also track and trend your performance over time. This particular chart shows the desktop support performance for an organization that over the course of the year, they improved from about 60% to almost 80%. The blue bars represent their monthly balanced scores. The purple background represents the trailing 12-month average. That's the beauty of the scorecard, is that it boils all of these disparate metrics, some with units of dollars, some with units of percent, some with units of days, and it boils it all down, normalizes it, creates a single overall measure from 0 to 100 that tells you how well you're doing, allows you to track and trend your performance, and enables you to compare to other support organizations. Now, to discuss the remaining 7 metrics on our short list, we're going to use a benchmarking case study. Real quickly, to define benchmarking, some of you I know are familiar with it because you're clients of MetricNets. Others may not be as familiar with what benchmarking is. Benchmarking involves comparing your desktop support performance to the performance of a benchmarking peer group. And when you identify performance gaps in cost or quality or service level or cycle time, you want to understand how the better performers in your benchmarking peer group achieve that better performance. Because if you understand how they did that, you can emulate them. You can selectively adopt and adapt what they have done, internalize it in your own organization, and thereby achieve a higher level of performance. You see, the real power of benchmarking is this. Given enough time, any organization will improve and can achieve world-class performance. But most organizations improve incrementally. They improve through trial and error. There's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears associated with that. What benchmarking says is that we already know what the best practices are. We've already figured it out. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to improve incrementally through blood, sweat, and tears, through trial and error. You can build upon the industry's proven best practices and achieve world-class performance, not at an evolutionary pace, but at a revolutionary pace. That's the real power of benchmarking. Now, earlier in today's presentation, I presented this chart when I was talking about what it meant to be a world-class performer. Now, if you're operating on this upper curve, you might have different absolute levels of performance at the 2 ends of the spectrum, but you are achieving the best possible result with the limited resources that you have. What benchmarking allows you to do is move from some less than optimal position into an optimal position. You know, they say there's no free lunch, but for any sub-optimized system, there is a free lunch, because if you squeeze the inefficiency out of the system, you can do it better, faster, cheaper. That sounds very cliche, but the reality is better, faster, cheaper, those represent the three dimensions of competition. Better means higher quality, faster means quicker mean times to resolve, cheaper means lower cost per ticket. Those are the three ways companies compete. You know, on cost, on quality, on cycle time. Those are the three dimensions of competition. So better, faster, cheaper actually is grounded in business principles. And what benchmarking enables you to do is take your support organization and figure out where those inefficiencies are and move the needle on both dimensions, reduce your cost, and at the same time improve the quality of service that you're able to deliver. Now that brings us to two more polling questions, and these are the final two polling questions of the day. The next polling question I want to ask, as you can imagine, has to do with benchmarking. And the polling question is this: have you benchmarked your desktop support organization within the past year? Now, as you're filling that out, the reason I ask the question is this, is because there's roughly a 1-to-1 correspondence between organizations that benchmark and those organizations that achieve world-class performance. Now, the obvious chicken or egg question is this: are the world-class desktop support organizations that way because they benchmark, or do they benchmark because they are that way? Well, there's a little bit of both. There are some organizations that, through trial and error, did in fact achieve world-class performance. It took them years and years and years, but they got there, and they managed to sustain that position through benchmarking. There are others that recognize that there's a quicker path to the top, and benchmarking is the best way to get there. Through benchmarking, they adopted the industry's best demonstrated practices and achieved world-class performance in a relatively short period of time. It doesn't have to take you months and months, let alone years and years. You can get there relatively quickly. Okay, it looks like most have weighed in on this polling question. So let me go ahead and close that poll down and share the results with you. Have you benchmarked your desktop support within the past year? 18% said yes, 70% no, 12% not applicable, presumably because you're unaffiliated with a desktop support organization. Once again, let me offer words of encouragement for those of you who have not benchmarked within the past year. Let me suggest that you might want to consider doing it because, as I mentioned momentarily just a few moments ago, there is roughly a 1-to-1 correspondence between those organizations that benchmark and those organizations that achieve world-class performance. For the 18% of you that have benchmarked within the past year, congratulations. You're probably in that elite category of world-class desktop support organizations. And then we have one final polling question, and that polling question is this. It also has to do with benchmarking. Do you plan to benchmark desktop support in the future? Yes, within the next 90 days. Yes, within the next 6 months. Yes, within the next year. No plans, or not applicable. While you're answering that, I just want to shout out to a few people. I do this on every webcast just to say thank you to those who dialed in and donated or used their precious time to participate in our webcast, and I'm just calling these names out at random. So Alan Hills, thanks for joining us today. Great to see you. Christine Gay, glad you could join us here. Harold Tate, great to see you on today's webcast. Laura McGee, glad you could join us. Sean Riebert, good to have you here. Stacy Basinger, glad you could join us. Terry Gibson, great to have you here. Okay, looks like most of you have voted. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll down, and I'm going to share those results with you. 9%, we had more than 100 participate in this particular poll. More than 9%, 9% are planning to benchmark within the next 90 days. Another 19% within the next 6 months. 27% within the next year, and 31% don't have any plans to benchmark at this time. For those of you who are planning to benchmark, let me again offer some words of encouragement, and those words are these. Benchmarking is the surest path to world-class performance. It's the quickest way to get there. It's the most efficient way to get there. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it really accelerates the path and the progress towards world-class performance. So those of you who are thinking about doing it, whether it's the next 90 days, next 6 months, or the next year, I would encourage you to follow through on those plans, because I think you'll find that it's probably about the best investment you can make in your desktop support organization. Okay, let's move on now in our discussion of industry best practices. And specifically what I'm going to do is present or start this section of the discussion with some some benchmarking data. Now this is from a real desktop support benchmark, but I want to caution you before you take your own data and compare it to all the metrics that you see here, the averages, the minimums, the maximums for this particular peer group. Be cautious because, as I mentioned a moment ago, when you benchmark, you really need to compare to a peer group that is similar to you, meaning that they operate in the same environment that you do. So if you're operating in a high-density environment, you're in a high-rise building as an example, and your travel time per ticket is 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, comparing yourself to, I gave the example of the military base where the travel times are an hour or two per ticket, and the techs get 1 or 2 tickets done per day. You need to be very cautious about comparing your own data to this. This is real data, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's comparable to your data. The single most important success factor in benchmarking is making sure that you have a fair, comparable peer group that is subject to the same operating environment and the constraints that you're operating under. Okay, we got 2 big problems with this desktop support group. The first is that their costs are high. Remember the foundation metrics, $81 per ticket versus $68 for the peer group average. So their costs are high, and their customer satisfaction is not very good. You can see that that's at 71%. The peer group is at 81%. Okay, so we've got 2 pretty serious problems here, and we need to figure out what's going on. And so we're going to go through a case study where we figure out, we diagnose why their costs are high and why their customer satisfaction is low. So let's start with the foundation metrics, cost per contact, customer satisfaction. Think about it on a 2-dimensional chart. We've got cost per ticket on the x-axis. We've got quality or effectiveness as measured by customer satisfaction on the y-axis. Think about the trade-off between these two and which quadrant you would be in. Are you in the low-cost, high-quality quadrant? That's where you want to be because that is where you are both efficient and effective. That's the holy grail of service and support, is to be in this upper right-hand quadrant. If you're in the upper left, it says that your quality is good, but your costs are too high. You need to figure out a way to reduce your costs over time, get into that upper right-hand quadrant. If you're in this lower right-hand quadrant, your costs are low, but so too is your quality, and you need to figure out a way to improve the quality of service that you deliver by moving up the chart, getting into that upper right-hand quadrant. If you're in the lower left, you've got the worst of everything. Your costs are high, your quality is low. You need to figure out a way to move up and to the right on this chart so that you, once again, you can end up in this quartile quadrant that is efficient and effective. So when you think about cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, the yin and yang of service and support, the 2 foundation metrics, be thinking that you always want to be in this upper right-hand quadrant. Now, if we look at the underlying drivers of cost, utilization is a big one. This is a labor-intensive function, just like the service desk is. So naturally, the more efficient you are in using your labor, the lower your costs are going to be. Here's the data on that. The blue diamonds are data points. The red line is a linear regression that runs through the data. Utilization, I'm going to define it momentarily for you here, but it's a measure of work time and travel time divided by total time that technicians are at work. So you can see that as utilization increases, the cost per ticket goes down. There's a fair amount of variance around this line. They call that the standard deviation. There's a fair amount of variance around that line, but the overall effect, you can clearly see that as utilization improves, cost per ticket goes down, which you would expect because, once again, it's a labor-intensive function. As your utilization increases, meaning better use of human resources, your costs are going to go down. Now, we define utilization as this: number of incidents handled by a tech in a month multiplied by the incident work time. Add to that the number of service requests they handle in a month multiplied by the service request work time. Add to that the travel time multiplied by the number of tickets handled. So what you've got in the numerator of this ratio is incident work time, service request work time, and total travel time. You divide that by the number of working minutes in a month, which, in case you've ever wondered, is about 9,800. So just using this example, 60 incidents per tech per month, 24 service requests per tech per month, that's 84 tickets. Made up some numbers here: 32-minute work time for incidents, 59-minute work time for service requests, 41-minute travel time. If you plug those into this formula, you come up with a utilization figure of 70%. What that says is that 70% of the time that those techs are at work, they are either in work or travel mode. In other words, they are in productive mode. Now, it doesn't mean they're goofing off 30% of the time. I mean, that 30% could be in training, it could be in administrative time, it could be in sick days, vacation days, holidays. We don't back any of that stuff out because we want to measure everyone in our database exactly the same way, so we don't back out sick days, vacation days, travel time, or training time, administrative time, or any of that kind of stuff. And the industry average is right around 60%, as it turns out, so this 70% number is actually pretty good. Let's look at the underlying drivers of customer satisfaction. There's first contact res rate for incidents, there's your service levels, your mean times to resolve, and there is technician job satisfaction. So technician job satisfaction versus customer satisfaction. Once again, blue diamonds are data points, red line is a linear regression. Your first contact resolution rate on incidents, as that improves, so too does your customer satisfaction. And as your mean time to resolve incidents increases, your customer satisfaction goes down. So there's the proof positive that high levels of technician job satisfaction correlate with higher levels of customer satisfaction. Higher first contact resolution rate for incidents correlates with higher customer satisfaction, and quicker or shorter mean times to resolve correlate with higher customer satisfaction. So let's look at training hours and what impact that has. New technician training hours, blue diamonds are data points, red lines linear regression, versus technician job satisfaction. Technician job satisfaction is important because it directly impacts customer satisfaction. New tech training hours has a positive influence on tech job satisfaction. Annual training hours, meaning after the initial training that they receive on an annual basis, that is also correlated with technician job satisfaction. As this number improves, so too does the technician job satisfaction. And if we look at experience levels, the average time on job, as that improves, incident first contact resolution rate goes up. That's no surprise. As you get more experienced in your job, you get better at it. Why would we care about that? Well, because incident FCR is a big driver of customer satisfaction. So time on job, that is tenure, training hours, they indirectly impact customer satisfaction because they influence the service levels and the first contact resolution rate. So now we've got our cause and effect diagram. Here are the foundation metrics: cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, driven respectively by technician utilization, first contact resolution rate. We've got a tertiary set of metrics that also fold into or ultimately lead up into customer satisfaction and cost per ticket. Now that we understand this linkage, this cause and effect diagram, the interrelationships between these key performance indicators, we can start to understand why this desktop support organization had high costs and why their customer satisfaction was not very good. Remember, FCR for incidents and your service levels have a lot to do with customer satisfaction. So let's look at that first. 71% customer satisfaction, you're 10 percentage points below the peer group. Let's look at your service levels. It takes 9.1 hours to respond to an incident. Peer group's at 6.3 hours. 33% of incidents are resolved within 24 clock hours versus 51% for the peer group. 2.6% is 2.6 work days is the average mean time to resolve an incident versus 1.9 work days for the peer group. And in terms of service requests, it takes 12.7 days to complete a service request versus 7.4 days for the peer group. Okay, their service levels are not good, which is why their customer satisfaction is not good. It's pretty straightforward. So service levels are weak, customer satisfaction is also weak, 71% versus 81%. The short story here was that they simply had to put in place some performance targets on their service levels and hold the technicians accountable for achieving those performance targets. Within a matter of 30 days, they'd improved their responsiveness and their resolution times fairly dramatically. It didn't take a lot of time and effort to fix this problem, but understanding this cause and effect diagram was key to helping them improve their customer satisfaction rates. What about cost? Well, the big driver of cost is technician utilization. If we look at that here, we see that technician utilization is 46% versus 54% for the peer group. The short story here is that they were just overstaffed. They had too many people. And that's a pretty common problem in desktop support. The reason it's so common is because most desktop support organizations don't track their work time, they don't track their travel time, and they just sort of eyeball, how many technicians do I need, which is why you might want to download the white paper from our website that talks about how to determine the appropriate headcount of technicians for desktop support. But the vast majority of desktop support organizations have no clue what their utilization is. They don't know what their workload is, and as a result, they're just guessing when it comes to headcount. But when they actually start to track their metrics, they can sometimes realize that, wow, okay, maybe we are overstaffed, which this organization was. They were overstaffed by about 7 technicians. The good news, well, maybe it's good news, I'm not quite sure. If you look at their turnover, it's 53% per year. That's not good. The peer group's at 24%. Turnover is only good if you're trying to downsize, which they did have to do. As I have mentioned, they shed 7 or 8 technicians, which allowed them to get their utilization up to almost 60%, which allowed them to get their cost per ticket down to about $60. So the short story here was the same as the long story, pretty straightforward. Their costs were high because their technician utilization was low. Their utilization was low because they were overstaffed. Because their turnover was so high, they were able to attrit, that is, they didn't have to lay anybody off. They were able to simply not backfill when they lost technicians. They were able to attrit 7 FTEs in a relatively short period of time. Within about 90 to 120 days, they were able to get their utilization back in line with the peer group, again, almost 60%, and their costs down to below the peer group cost per ticket. Okay, normally I would stop and do a brief Q&A here, but I want to make sure I finish on time at 3:30. And so I'm going to skip this Q&A. Rest assured that at the conclusion of the webcast in roughly 15 or 16 minutes, I will answer all the questions that have been typed in. So I'm not going to skip any questions. I'm just going to defer them until the end of the latter part of the presentation. We've talked so far about strategy and the leverage and the economic potential of service and support. We've also talked about the importance of key performance indicators and the cause-effect relationship, and this idea that KPIs are to be used holistically. They're to be used not just to track and trend performance, but to diagnose strength and weakness through benchmarking, and then to develop action plans based upon that, and then to actually act on that information so that you can improve your service and support organization. Let's talk now about human resource management, which is all about managing the human resources over the life cycle that they are working in service and support. This first chart is a little bit of a cheat sheet. I've listed some best practices in human resource management on the left here. This is not a complete list of HR best practices, but these are some of the better known best practices around recruitment and training and career pathing and retention. I've described the best practice in a little bit more detail in this second column from the left. And then in the upper right corner, I've listed a number of KPIs. I call them the affected KPIs, cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, utilization, and so on. At the intersection of these KPIs and the best practices, you will find a cell. And that cell will be either white in color or light blue in color or dark blue in color. If it's dark blue in color, it says that there is a strong cause and effect relationship between the best practice and the affected KPI. So if you go off and do a benchmark and you find that your mean time to resolve is high, which it was in the example that we just went through here, mean time to resolve incidents, 2.6 days versus 1.9 for the peer group, mean time to complete service requests, 12.7 days versus 7.4 days for the peer group, you find that your MTTR is high. One way to remediate that is through more effective training. Now that might seem obvious, but some of these cause and effect relationships are not so obvious. And again, white means no cause and effect relationship between the affected KPI and the best practice. Light blue means only a slight or a mild cause and effect relationship between the affected KPI. It's the dark blue cells that represent a strong cause and effect relationship between the affected KPI and the best practice. So if you determine that there is a gap in any one of these KPIs, you can use this chart, this cheat sheet, if you will, to identify what are the human resource levers you have at your disposal in order to improve the first contact resolution rate for incidents, or to make the utilization better, or to improve customer satisfaction, or to reduce the cost per ticket. Look for the dark blue cells because those give you insight into the best practices that will help you close a performance gap in any of these affected key performance indicators. Now earlier I introduced the concept of the scorecard for desktop support, and here I'm going to introduce the concept of the scorecard for individual technicians who work in desktop support. Mechanically this works exactly the same way as the desktop support scorecard. It's simply applied at an individual level. You will also see that some of the metrics are a little bit different. We've included a metric for unplanned absenteeism, and we've also included a metric as somewhat subjective, teamwork, initiative, and mentoring. Even though those are subjective, you can quantify them. You can put them on a scale of 1 to 5, and just rank, the individual, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So even subjective factors can be included in a scorecard. Now the value of creating a scorecard on a monthly basis for each individual technician that works in desktop support is this. When you deliver feedback to that technician, when you coach them, when you're trying to help them understand where their strengths are, this particular technician is doing a great job here, scored 100%, got a 5 on initiative. They're not doing as well in this area right here. This is the number of service requests closed in a month. they might want to up their game a little bit. Overall, this technician did pretty well on most of these metrics right here. Their overall score was 43.7%. But the value of this is that it objectifies what is otherwise a very subjective process. Now, all of us have been on both the delivering end and the receiving end of performance reviews. And you know that many of them, if not most of them, are somewhat unsatisfactory. And I don't mean your performance is unsatisfactory. What I mean is that it's not very insightful. It's not very actionable. You know, your supervisor sits down with you, or you sit down with the person you're reviewing, and you kind of wave your arms a little bit and say you're doing a good job here, you could do a better job over here, but it tends to be fairly subjective. What this individual scorecard is meant to do is take the subjectivity out of it and create an objective feedback mechanism that enables you to sit down with your technicians once a month or once a quarter, a couple times a year, whatever it might be, and show them where they're doing well and where they need to improve their performance. And again, mechanically, this works exactly the same way as the overall desktop support scorecard. You're simply applying it at an individual level. Now, many of our clients take this even further, and they will actually post the results on a monthly basis. Now, they're not trying to embarrass anybody by doing this. What they're trying to do is help each individual that works in desktop support understand what level of contribution they are making to the organization. So they designate them by numbers. They don't show any last names here for the reason I just mentioned. They rank them, and so that every technician can see, here's 43.7 that we just went through on this chart right here, 43.7. This technician ranked 17th out of 25 technicians. It's not a great ranking, but it does look like this technician has been improving. Their 6-month average balance score was 27.6%. They're up to 43.7%. So what it tells me is that their performance is getting better. Now, what this does is that it helps each technician understand where they rank, helps them understand how they stack up relative to others in desktop support, but it also, for those that aren't performing well, it either gives them an incentive to improve or it gives them an incentive to move on. And that's not a bad thing. If somebody's in the wrong job, if they're not performing well, if they're just not cut out for this kind of work, and they decide because of this process, you know, they've ended up in the bottom quartile or the bottom few rankings for the past several months, they may come to the conclusion, you know, I thought this was the job for me, but maybe it's not, so I'm going to go do something different. That's not a bad thing. And I believe that this mechanism does help in both ways. It helps those that aren't performing well get their act together because it does provide very specific feedback on where you can improve your performance, and it gives them an incentive to improve their performance. And for those that seem to be struggling and don't see a lot of hope for improvement, they may make a decision to move on. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the beauty of this is that it gives you a very objective feedback mechanism for delivering coaching and feedback to the individual technicians that they can use to improve their performance and deliver a bigger, better contribution to the desktop support organization. Now, one misconception about service and support is that technician job satisfaction, this is particularly true in level 1 support, less true in desktop support, but low levels of morale, low levels of job satisfaction are epidemic in this industry. This is why the industry is such a high turnover business. And many have erroneously assumed that the technician job satisfaction is just nothing you just can't do anything about it. The morale is not going to be good, the job satisfaction will be low, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. But that's not true. You actually have at least three fairly important levers for impacting job satisfaction. And those are the quality and amount of coaching, the quality and amount of training hours that the technicians get, and the existence of a bona fide career path. Now, I went through earlier in the KPI section how training hours affect customer satisfaction. The more training hours they get, both initially and annually, the higher the technician satisfaction will be. Here's the data on the career path. The blue diamonds represent job satisfaction with a career path, average job satisfaction 81%. The fuchsia-colored squares, pink squares, whatever that color is, technician job satisfaction when there is no career path averages only 72%. So here the data does show that when you have a bona fide documented career path for the technicians, the job satisfaction is going to be higher. Let's turn to the final section of our best practices model now and talk about marketing, which is really more about managing stakeholder perceptions and expectations. And what I want to do is introduce a two-dimensional chart for you here that is going to come up 3 or 4 times in this section of the presentation. The x-axis shows the actual value being delivered by desktop support. We could measure that through a benchmark as an example. The y-axis shows the perceived value. That is, what do the stakeholders think you're doing? That is, those in leadership in IT, the end users, those outside of IT, leadership in your company, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, CEO. What do they think about what you're doing? Well, it turns out that the actual value and the perceived value are almost never one and the same thing. If they were, you would end up somewhere on this diagonal line here, because if your actual value is low and the perception is low, well, at least it's a fair perception. If the value that you're delivering is high and the perception is that the value is high, well, again, that's an accurate perception. But the only locus of points that makes sense on this chart is the diagonal line. If you end up on that diagonal line, perception and reality are one and the same. But that doesn't happen very often. What usually happens is that most support organizations end up in the lower right, and it's a dangerous position to be in, which is why I've colored it red. The reason this happens, we all know why, is because when end users have a bad experience with desktop support or the level 1 service desk, they tell 10, 12, maybe 15 people. If they have a good experience, they don't tell anybody. So although you personally may have had a good experience with desktop support, the buzz that you hear through the grapevine around the water cooler is that, desktop support lost Mary's ticket, or they said they were going to replace John's hard drive and they never showed up, or they said they were going to, re-image this person's computer and they completely messed everything up. That's what you tend to hear about. You don't hear about the Herculean great things that they did, these great accomplishments. You hear about the bad stuff. And so over time, even though your personal experiences may have been good, your perceptions start to decrease because you hear all this negative buzz. And again, it's because negative news gets repeated multiple times. Good news never travels very far. And so most support organizations end up in this lower right-hand corner, which is a dangerous position to be in. It's dangerous because decisions are based on perception, not reality. And if the perception is that you're not doing a good job, decisions that are adverse to your well-being could be made. It might be a decision not to fund a project. It might be a decision not to authorize additional staff or additional budget. It might be a decision to outsource when that's not justified, or a decision to insource when that's not justified. I'm neither pro nor con insourcing or outsourcing, but I believe they should be done based on real information. And so we got a dilemma here. That perception and reality tend to diverge, and we need to close this perception gap, because if you're doing a good job, we want to make sure you get credit for it. And so this section of our best practices model is all about closing the gap between perception and reality. And although this doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't cost a lot of money, it is as important to manage this message, this gap, as it is to manage your actual performance. So far, we've been talking about actual performance. How do you maximize it? How do you strike the right balance between cost and quality? How do you measure your performance? So we've been talking about this x-axis all along. Now we're going to talk about the vanity axis. That is, how do you make yourself look good? How do you close this gap between perception and reality? And again, it is as important as your actual performance, even though it only represents a relatively small percentage of the time and effort that you're going to be spending in desktop support. Now, to answer this question, MetricNet has put together a model. It addresses 5 W's, who are the key stakeholders, what are the messages you're going to communicate, when, under what circumstances do you communicate these messages, how do you reach the stakeholders, what are the channels you use to reach them, and then a bit of a rhetorical question, why are we doing all this? There's a punchline at the end, which you'll recognize, I think. The short story here, and by the way, we do a half-day presentation on this for organizations that want to improve their internal image. I'm going to give you the 3 or 4 minute version here. In terms of timing, you want frequent contact with your end users. And by the way, for those of you who were on last month's webcast, this will be review for you. But it is just as important to manage your message for desktop support as it is for the service desk. So at new employee orientation, there should be a module on desktop support. When end users log in, there should be something on end user support, a phone number, a click to chat, a list of services, a service catalog. When there's specific IT training, there should be at least a short module on end user support to let them know here are the services they offer, here are the hours that they're open, etc. When an incident or a service request is open, you need to be communicating periodically with the end user to ensure that you're managing expectations appropriately. And then it's scheduled sessions like what I'm doing right now. An increasing number of our clients once a month will schedule webcasts for any end user that wants to hear about what's going on with desktop support, what's going on with the service desk, what new tools are they using, what were the results of the most recent customer satisfaction survey, for example. In terms of messaging, you want to be communicating your services, key initiatives. For example, if you're adopting a new trouble ticket system or a new knowledge management system or a remote diagnostic tool like BombGuard or GoToAssist or LogMeIn, you want to let them know about that. What are your performance levels, good, bad, or indifferent? You always score points when you are very open and transparent about your performance. FAQs. What are some of the frequently asked questions along with the answers to those FAQs? And then, obviously, you want to take credit for successes that you have had. If you've improved your FCR, reduced your mean time to resolve, improved your customer satisfaction, let the stakeholders know about that. How do you communicate? Well, user liaisons, these are individuals that agree to act as eyes and ears for service and support within entities within the organization. They might be in HR, they might be in sales or marketing or accounting or finance, but they agree to act as your eyes and ears, and they report back, basically give you information. Here's what our end users are thinking, and you in turn are able to communicate to the end users through those liaisons. Think about them as your congressmen, congresswomen that work within the organization and represent service and support. Newsletters, quarterly newsletters, reference guides, customer sat surveys, publishing the results of those, and then login messages. These are all ways that you can communicate with these key stakeholders. But if you do this effectively, you have frequent contact, you communicate multiple messages, you use the available channels, you will close that gap between perception and reality. And here's a punchline I mentioned earlier. We've heard this expression, expectations not set or expectations not met, so we need to be serious about managing these expectations. Now, more than a dozen years ago, a client sent this comic to me. The way it reads is, delight customers, why can't we just satisfy them like we used to? Well, customer satisfaction is good, but it's not enough. Satisfied customers are not necessarily loyal customers. They don't necessarily do business with you because they want to. They're not going to propagate positive word-of-mouth referrals. What you want are delighted or enthusiastic customers because they're the ones that are loyal. They're the ones that propagate positive word-of-mouth referrals. They're the ones that do business with you because they want to, not because they have to. And this is why it's critical to make sure your customers are delighted and enthusiastic, because you, as the gateway to IT for the vast majority of end users, have a unique opportunity and a special responsibility. The opportunity is to influence end users towards a positive view of all of IT, not just for service and support, but to influence end users so that they end up with a positive view of all of IT. The responsibility is that what you do at that interface reverberates throughout the organization and is magnified many times over. And so you have both a responsibility and an opportunity at this interface. That responsibility, that opportunity is a great source of leverage. This is why it's important to think about customer enthusiasm and customer delight, not just customer satisfaction. So in summary, when it comes to marketing, managing this gap that inevitably exists between perception and reality is pretty straightforward. It doesn't take a lot of time or cost a lot of money. But as I mentioned earlier, it's as important to manage this message as it is to manage your actual performance. Some of the benefits include customer loyalty, positive word-of-mouth referrals, credibility. When you have credibility, you can get things done. You can get the resources you need to make things happen, create a positive image for all of IT, and drive high levels of customer satisfaction. So let me summarize what we've learned, and then I'm going to wrap up with a few suggestions on how you can get the most out of today's webcast. We've gone through a four-part model that talks about strategy, being proactive and preventive, thinking about desktop support as part of an end-to-end support process. Remember SPOC, single point of contact. Understand total cost of ownership. Get it done at level 1. Minimize the percent resolved level 1 capable. And then recognizing how value is created. We talked about 3 fundamental sources of value: reducing total cost of ownership, returning productivity to end users, and driving a positive view of all of IT. Secondly, performance measurement. Less is more. There's an 80-20 rule when it comes to KPIs, but you should have a balanced scorecard that gives you your overall performance level. You should be benchmarking once a year, and it's important to understand the cause and effect relationship of these key performance indicators, because if you understand those, you can pull the levers you need to pull to achieve desired outcomes. When it comes to human resource management, technician training and development is not just motherhood and apple pie. It has a real impact on the quality of those technicians and their overall job satisfaction. A career path will improve job satisfaction, which in turn improves customer satisfaction. Coaching and feedback should be given frequently and objectively. Remember the individual technician scorecard I introduced. That is a key part of driving individual accountability within service and support. And finally, think about marketing as actively managing your brand. Recognize that perception and reality are rarely one and the same. You are a key driver of perceptions, not just for desktop support, but for all of IT. And you can also think about communicating value, actively communicating value. Remember the three sources of value: minimize total cost of ownership, return productivity to end users, and drive a positive image and message for all of IT. So the bottom line on desktop support best practices is this. Desktop support is now being managed as a strategic asset within the enterprise, one that can reduce the overall cost of IT, improve productivity for end users, and drive a positive view of IT. Now, strategic desktop support organizations have a number of success factors in common. First, they almost inevitably follow a SPOC model. They're part of an end-to-end support process. Secondly, they understand the economics of TCO for user support, and as a result, they are active about maximizing FCR and first-level resolution rates. They use performance metrics not just to create pretty charts and to see how they stack up relative to other organizations. They use them diagnostically and prescriptively. They invest in training and coaching and career pathing. They actively manage their internal message, and they aggressively promote and communicate the value that they create and drive for the organization. Now, in a minute, I'm going to get to the questions that are queued up and that have been typed into the dialog box and do a Q&A session. But before I do the Q&A, I just want to make a few closing remarks. There are a number of things that you can do almost immediately to get some benefit out of today's session. The first, I'll repeat it again, if you're in Las Vegas next month, I would invite you to attend any or all of the three presentations MetricNet will be delivering. One on the results of our 2014 desktop support benchmark, the second one on the strategic role of IT leadership in service and support, and the third presentation on the evolution of service desk KPIs over the last 25 years and the rise of the strategic service and support organization. I would invite you to go to our website and explore around. If you go to the resource library, you'll find all sorts of cool free stuff. I pointed out 3 of the white papers that you could potentially download there earlier. Becoming a premium member is free, and it gives you access to all of our behind the member wall content. You can go there anytime you want, download all the content you want. I would invite you to connect with us on social media, where we put out a pretty steady stream of information that IT service and support professionals might find useful. In the copy of the presentation itself, I've provided links to all of our social media pages and groups. Don't forget to register for our upcoming webcast. In March, we're going to be looking at call center best practices. In April, service desk KPIs. May, desktop support KPIs. And in June, we'll be looking at call center key performance indicators. Browse our resource library. I just mentioned that. You'll find all sorts of white papers, presentations, magazine articles, and the like on service desk and desktop support best practices, benchmarking results, and key performance indicators. And if you're interested in benchmarking, we offer a number of alternatives, from peer group benchmarks to industry benchmarks that can be downloaded from our website, benchmarking data files for those who want to do it themselves. We also have the one-year path to world-class performance for those that want a guaranteed path within 12 months to achieving world-class performance. Finally, you can reach MetricNet in the United States at this phone number. It's 703-992-7559, or you can send us an email at info@metricnet.com. Now, for those who have time to stay on for a few more minutes, I will be answering any questions that you typed in during the webcast. And for those who must exit the webcast at this time, I want to thank you for attending this session. I do hope you found it to be informative and insightful. Please remember to complete the brief survey that pops up when you exit the webcast. This is a requirement if you wish to receive a copy of today's presentation. Thank you once again. Let's take a look at the questions we have. Okay. Question from Patrick. Can I download the slides? Yes, later this evening the slides will be posted on our website. We will give you a link to that, assuming that you complete the survey. There should be a survey that pops up when you exit the GoToWebinar, and just complete that, 3 questions pretty quick. We'll send you a link that will get you to those slides, and you can download them right from our website. From Frank, do you have median salary rates in 1988 and last year? Yes, we do. On one of the early slides, I showed what the average starting salaries were in 1988 versus 2014. So I'm not sure if you saw that, and maybe that prompted the question, or maybe I'm not fully understanding your question, but I believe on roughly page 10, thereabouts, of the presentation, we had some information on the average starting salaries in North America for desktop support technicians in 1988 versus 2014. Question from Sam, are the salaries inflation adjusted? They were, yes. Another question from Sam, cost per seat, has that been inflation adjusted? The answer is yes, it was inflation adjusted. From Miguel, that's incredible, all resolution and cost indicators have regressed. At first glance, the metrics that I showed, Miguel, do appear that desktop support has gone backwards in the last 25 years. But I suspect that shortly after you type this question in, you heard my comment about how, although it looks like they haven't improved, they actually have improved because the number of tickets they're resolving that could and should have been resolved at level 1 has decreased dramatically from more than 50% to somewhere in the low 20s, which has made their workload more complex, which is why the handle times are longer. It's why the first contact resolution rate is a little bit lower. Okay, from Edward, do you have any correlation between number of times customers call tech support and propensity to churn? Churn what, Edward? If you could elaborate, I don't know if you mean churn for the technicians that work in desktop support. I'm not sure what you mean by churn. But let me just make an assumption, and you can type another question in to clarify this if you would. The correlation between number of times a customer calls and propensity to churn. If you're talking about churn in technicians in desktop support, no, I've seen no correlation there. If you're talking about customer churn, meaning the more they call, the more they leave, I've not seen that either. So I think maybe there's some part of your question that I'm missing. I would ask you to maybe elaborate a little bit on the question so that I can more fully understand it and perhaps give you a better answer. Okay, from Jim, how do you compare, contrast between desktop support versus field support? Where do you position image management, application packaging, et cetera? Desktop support to us is when you go to the site of the user or the device and you don't get into a vehicle to do it. You're able to get there on your own 2 feet and you provide service and support locally to a device or to a user. Field support is when you're using a vehicle to get to the site of the device or the user. Now, things like image management are sometimes part of desktop support. They're not always, but they sometimes are a part of desktop support. Application packaging, sometimes that is part of desktop support, but not always. But image management and application packaging, I would not consider, typically to be part of field services or field support, but they often are sometimes part of desktop support. Hope that answers your question, Jim. From Lee, where can I get a copy of the presentation? Lee, fill out the questionnaire. It pops up when you exit the webcast, and we'll send you a link that allows you to download the slides. Okay, from David, your model and best practices do not appear to incorporate automation or problem prevention, which you alluded to on the shift left slide. I think shift left may impact utilization low, but could improve both costs and satisfaction. No, shift left actually increases costs of resolution per ticket at desktop support and level 1 support. And the reason it does that, David, is because the stuff that gets shifted left is the easy stuff. The stuff that's left over at level 1 and at desktop support is the harder stuff. And so the work time is going to be longer for what's left over after you shift things to the left. Overall, I would agree with you. Your total, that's where TCO comes in. Your total cost of ownership is going to be lower as you shift left. I would agree with you there. But your cost per ticket actually goes up when you start to shift left. The reason being that what is left over at level 1 and at desktop support is a more complex set of issues because you've eliminated the easy stuff by moving it to the left. You're moving it into self-help or moving it to level 1. So cost per ticket will go up if you're successful at shifting left. Your overall total cost of ownership will go down. From KB, what's the best way to determine client satisfaction? There's 2 parts of that question. One is, what's the survey vehicle look like? And the second is, how do you administer the survey? The survey vehicle can be anything from an email survey to, say, every 5th or every 10th, send out to every 5th or every 10th ticket. Do not send it to every ticket. Too many organizations do that, and it's just annoying to the end users if they get a survey every time that they do business with you. You want to do it less frequently than that. You never want to survey a person more than twice a year. So our recommendation is every 5th or every 10th ticket, send a survey out, but you should have a mechanism that prevents you from over-surveying, prevents you from surveying the same person more than twice in a year. So there are email surveys, there are flash surveys that if you're delivering support over the phone, the user stays on the line, they answer a brief survey by punching buttons on their phone and give you some feedback that way. And there are also live interview surveys where you call up the individual and you ask them a series of questions. Each of those has pros and cons. The flash survey is the least expensive, but it also gives you the least insight. The interview type surveys are the most expensive, but they also give you the most insight. Most organizations rely on email sampling, as I mentioned a few moments ago, and they get their survey results that way, but don't expect a huge response. The average response is only about 2.5 or 3%. So you send out 1,000 surveys, you might get 25 or 30 back. It's not a huge response rate, but typically if you send enough surveys, you get enough responses to get something that is statistically significant. Now, the second part of that question is what should be in the survey, and I'll give you just a few general principles around this, which is keep it short, 5 or fewer questions. Ask for the questions to be graded on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being, excellent, 4 being very good, 3 being, fair, 2 being poor, and 1 being unsatisfactory. For example, you're going to ask a series of questions. Was the technician, or how, to what extent do you agree with this statement? The technician was polite and courteous. The technician was technically competent. The technician communicated effectively. Generally, you want fewer than 5 questions. You want to grade it on a scale of 1 to 5. The 4s and 5s represent satisfied customers. And if you end up with 80% 4s and 5s, what it means is that your customer satisfaction is roughly 80%. That's kind of the high-level view of it. There's a whole lot more to it than that, as anybody who's been involved in customer surveying before can attest. But I'm trying to give you the real short version of both the channels that you could potentially use and some tips on how you want to survey your customers. Okay, from Ruben, will this entire session be available as well? Yes, we record this session. We're going to send a link out. So if you want to watch it again, or you want your colleagues or peers at work to watch today's webcast, you'll have that opportunity because we have recorded it. From Robert, I've been in the service support industry for 30+ years, been in service support role for 30+ years, and agree with everything in your presentation. Very professional, thank you. Okay, thank you, Robert. Glad you could join us today. From Jorge, will the presentation be available for repeat listening? Yes, I just answered that question. From Jose, I'm concerned about MetricNet being I'm sorry, misread that. I'm concerned about Metric being a method for upper management to move to an outsourced desktop support model. What can teams do to prevent this? If management's using metrics to justify outsourcing, to be honest with you, Jose, they're doing the right thing. Because if the metrics are accurate and the metrics are saying that you'd be better, faster, cheaper as an outsourced desktop support organization, I support that. I'm sorry to tell you that, and I know it doesn't sound like you're happy to hear that answer. But metrics are how you make decisions. And assuming, this is a big assumption, I'll grant you that, assuming that they have good metrics and they are interpreting those metrics effectively, and those metrics say that an outsourcer will do it better, faster, cheaper, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So I don't know all the particulars of your situation, Jose, but the idea, you're suggesting here that they're using metrics as justification to outsource, which is exactly what they should do. If they're going to outsource or insource or make any other big decision around headcount or funding or anything like that, metrics are the way to go. And if the metrics are telling you that outsourcing is a better approach, I have a hard time arguing with that. So the approach, if I'm understanding it correctly, using metrics to make this decision is the right approach. The question is, are they the right metrics, or are they interpreting them correctly? From Cindy, how does a desktop support staff have metrics for first call resolution? It's not first call resolution, Cindy, it's first incident visit resolution rate, meaning that the first time you touch the device or see the end user, you get it resolved. In other words, it doesn't take multiple trips, it doesn't take a follow-up phone call, that kind of thing. So it's the corollary, or the comparable metric to first contact resolution rate at level 1. We call it first incident visit resolution rate, or first visit incident resolution, sorry. Are they part of the service desk, or is this service desk not the single point of contact? Now, FCR, first contact resolution rate, is a service desk metric. incident versus visit resolution rate is a desktop support metric, and I hope I'm answering your question. Okay, so from Edward, churn is customer retention. Customer retention. So I'm wondering, are you in an outsourced environment? Are you an outsourcer? Can you elaborate on that? Because I'm starting to sense here that if you're talking about customer churn, and if I go back to your original question here, do you have any correlation between number of times a customer calls tech support and the propensity to churn? If you're an outsourcer and the customer is having to call you too many times, that's not going to reflect well on the service that you're providing, and they may churn you, meaning that they may get rid of the outsourcer and find another outsourcer. I still don't think I'm interpreting your question correctly, but if the question is, does that affect our relationship with the customer? If the end user has to call us too many times, the answer is absolutely yes, it does affect the relationship. Okay, from, let's see, Robert, does depot support affect the data? Depot support absolutely affects the data. Depot is, it could be anything from just a parts supply warehouse to an entire, imaging, repair, replenishment facility. So depot absolutely affects the data. Not all desktop support organizations have a parts depot. Many outsource that. Anything that needs to be repaired or replaced gets sent out. But many larger organizations will have a parts depot, and that will absolutely affect the data. If that's considered part of desktop support, you're going to have technicians associated with your depot. You're going to have costs associated with your depot. So this gets back to, when you do a comparison, if you do a benchmark, you need to make sure that those you're benchmarking against have a similar set of responsibilities. And if you've got a depot, you need to be comparing against other desktop support groups that also have a depot. Okay, from Travis, you mentioned copies of the slides will be posted. I see this is recorded as well. Can we review the recording? Yes, you can review the recording. We'll send you a link to the recording so you can watch it as many times as you want. You can also have your peers and colleagues watch it. And you can also download the slides. We'll send out, Travis will send out a link to you later this afternoon that will allow you to download those slides. And there will be a separate link that allows you to watch the recorded webcast. Okay, from Jorge, in what support level would you place self-healing technology, and what is the average cost? There's not a lot of data on self-healing technology, Jorge. A number of years ago, everyone said that self-healing technology was going to become so effective and so pervasive that both desktop support and level 1 support would be eliminated. But the success stories are very few and far between. Self-healing technology is really level -1, because if a problem is really self-healing, it's a problem the user never experiences. So it would be level -1. However, as I mentioned, success stories for self-healing are very few and far between. It was a huge, there were huge expectations 8 or 10 years ago about self-healing. It just has not materialized. It hasn't come to fruition. And so, reports of the demise of service desk and desktop support were greatly exaggerated back then, and they're greatly exaggerated now, despite the fact that desktop support is being virtualized and all this other kind of stuff. The need for technicians, the need for human support will never go away. But self-healing is one of those technologies that never really materialized to any great extent. In terms of the average cost, I can't comment on that because so few of our clients have truly embraced and engaged self-healing technologies. Okay, from Lyle, how easy or hard is it to incorporate the KPIs into an ITSM product? These KPIs, any ITSM product should be agnostic, meaning that it should be neutral when it comes to key performance indicators. And if it's difficult to incorporate a KPI like % resolved level 1 capable or mean time to resolve into your ITSM product, then you may have the wrong product, because ITSM should be favorable towards any and all metrics and should make it very easy to adopt whatever KPIs you want to include in your support environment. So some tools make it quite easy to incorporate those metrics. Others, not so much. I'm not going to get into naming vendors because we are vendor neutral. I guess what I'll say, Lyle, is be careful when you select ITSM tools, because you want to ensure that defining metrics the way you want to define them is not only allowed within your ITSM tool, but is relatively easy and straightforward within your tool. Okay. Okay, so Edward once again elaborated on his question, propensity for customers to churn increase with the higher incidence of tickets, dissatisfaction. The answer is yes. There is some churn. If the customer is calling back multiple times, they're not going to be happy. As the repeat call rate increases, you see customer satisfaction go down. If you are an outsourcer, that means that your job is in jeopardy. It means that the customer is not going to be happy and they're going to start looking for alternatives. Okay, from Gilbert, really enjoyed the session. Thank you, Gilbert. From Lyle, thank you. Any other questions? I've gotten to the end of what appear to be the questions. If you'd like to type in one last question, I'm still here. I'm more than happy to answer it for you. Okay, looks like we've come to the end of our webcast. So I want to thank all of you once again. And we've still got a couple hundred of you on the webcast, so you hung in here until the very end. I thank you so much for that. I do hope you found today's session to be informative and insightful. Once again, I'll just remind you, if you would, to complete the survey that pops up when you exit the webcast, because this is a precondition to getting a copy of the slides for today's presentation. This concludes our webcast. Thank you very much for joining MetricNet for best practices in desktop support. Goodbye now.